The United States Army has been operating without its top uniformed officer after Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth removed General Randy George. And that vacancy is not happening in isolation. Senior commanders have been pushed out, critical leadership positions have gone unfilled, and warnings from current and former military officials are now raising a much bigger question. Did Washington weaken its own military command structure at exactly the moment American forces needed it most? Start with the number that makes this impossible to dismiss as ordinary Pentagon turnover. In January of 2025, the Army reportedly had 10 active duty 4-star generals. It now has 5, the fewest in decades. Some positions were eliminated, others remain vacant, and several senior officers who might have succeeded George were themselves forced out. That does not automatically prove that every removal was a mistake. Presidents and defense secretaries have broad authority to reshape military leadership. Generals are not entitled to permanent commands, and civilian control of the military requires elected leaders to be able to replace senior officers. But authority is only half the question. The other half is capability. One of the positions affected involves the command responsible for training and equipping Army ground forces, including Patriot missile crews. General David Haughton was selected for that command and then removed roughly 8 months later. That matters because Patriot systems became central to protecting American personnel and facilities from Iranian ballistic missile attacks. So the relevant standard is not whether Hegseth had the power to remove commanders. He did. The relevant question is whether those decisions left the military better prepared for the threats it was actually facing. And that brings us to General Christopher Donahue. Donahue had overseen American ground forces in Europe, where the war in Ukraine produced some of the most important modern lessons about drone warfare. His forces had developed experience with defending against relatively inexpensive unmanned systems. When Iranian drones became an immediate threat in the Middle East, teams trained around those lessons could be moved into the region. That is the contradiction. The Pentagon was confronting a battlefield increasingly defined by drones, missiles, electronic warfare, and expensive interception systems, while simultaneously disrupting senior leadership associated with modernization and lessons learned from Ukraine. And the cost equation is brutal. A Patriot interceptor can cost several $1,000,000. A THAAD interceptor can cost substantially more. An attacker does not need to destroy an American base with every missile or drone to create a strategic problem. If relatively inexpensive weapons repeatedly force the United States to expend extraordinarily expensive interceptors, the defender can win individual engagements while steadily losing inventory and financial flexibility. That does not mean American missile defense failed completely. It means the United States faced an asymmetric problem that competent planning should have anticipated. How long can you sustain a defense when the weapons used to stop an attack are dramatically more expensive and harder to replace than some of the weapons being fired at you? Now add another reported consequence. Iranian missile and drone attacks were described by people familiar with the damage as having inflicted unprecedented destruction on American intelligence facilities and surveillance equipment in the Middle East, potentially requiring billions of dollars in repairs. The significant point is not merely the price tag. Intelligence infrastructure is part of the system that tells commanders what is happening, where threats are moving, and what may happen next. Damage the eyes and ears, and every other military decision becomes harder. That gives us our first real answer. The leadership controversy is not fundamentally about personalities. It is about whether a rapid purge of experienced commanders created institutional gaps during a military crisis in which logistics, missile defense, intelligence, and drone warfare were already under extraordinary pressure. But there is another decision that makes that question harder for the Pentagon to explain. Military commanders reportedly objected when a Defense Department program intended to reduce civilian harm was dismantled. The program existed because targeting is not simply about hitting an enemy. It is also about distinguishing military objectives from civilians and reducing foreseeable harm during operations. Hegseth eliminated the program despite those objections. After civilian casualties from American strikes became an issue, the Pentagon was reportedly preparing to restore it. Think about the sequence rather than the politics. Commanders warn against removing a safeguard. Leadership removes it. Civilian casualties become a serious concern. Then the institution considers bringing the safeguard back. Reinstatement by itself would not prove that eliminating the program caused any particular civilian death. Individual strikes require individual evidence, but it does raise a legitimate accountability question. If military professionals warned that the capability was necessary, what evidence justified eliminating it in the first place? If the political parties were reversed, that should still be the standard. Not whether you like the Secretary of Defense, not whether you support the President. What did the commanders warn about? What decision was made? And what happened afterward? And this is exactly where political information becomes dangerous for ordinary viewers. A headline can tell you that a program was eliminated or restored without giving you the chronology that determines what the story actually means. Don't Get Played gives you a repeatable method for catching those missing pieces before you inherit somebody else's conclusion. The digital ebook costs $9 one time. Use the first link in the description or pinned comment, because the next piece is not about one program. It is about the entire strategic position of American forces in the Persian Gulf. Retired 4-star Army General Barry McCaffrey publicly described what he considers a strategic disaster. His argument is important because he separated American offensive power from the logistical system supporting it. McCaffrey emphasized that the Navy remains an extraordinary fighting force. American warships and aircraft carriers possess enormous offensive and defensive capability. His warning was about something less dramatic but potentially more decisive: bases, supplies, and access. He argued that Iranian ballistic missiles and drones had severely reduced the usefulness of American logistics facilities around the Persian Gulf, and that future support could increasingly depend on locations such as Diego Garcia, the Philippines, Western Saudi Arabia, and Southern Europe. McCaffrey went further, saying that in his judgment, the United States may have effectively lost access to as many as 15 Persian Gulf bases. That is his assessment, not an established final accounting from the Pentagon, and McCaffrey explicitly said his public analysis was not based on classified information or information solicited from active military leadership, but his distinction between combat power and logistics is crucial. You can possess the best aircraft in the world. They still require fuel, maintenance, munitions, runways, spare parts, and secure locations. A carrier strike group can project extraordinary force. It still depends on a supply chain. A missile defense battery can intercept incoming weapons only while it has interceptors. Military strength is not simply what appears in a weapons inventory. It is how long that inventory can remain operational under sustained attack. That makes the strongest defense of the administration worth considering. A defense secretary could reasonably argue that an entrenched bureaucracy needed disruption, that domestic weapons production had become dangerously inadequate, and that America had allowed critical defense supply chains to become too dependent on foreign suppliers. Hegseth has publicly emphasized expanding American production of weapons and components, including the industrial network supporting Patriot missiles. That argument has real merit. The United States absolutely needs deeper manufacturing capacity. A military that cannot replace the munitions it uses has a structural problem regardless of who occupies the White House. But that defense only partially survives the evidence. Expanding production tomorrow does not replace experienced command capacity removed yesterday. Industrial policy cannot retroactively refill a leadership vacancy during an active crisis. And slogans about rebuilding the arsenal do not answer why experienced officers were removed without a replacement structure capable of preserving continuity. The same standard applies to the civilian protection program. Leadership has every right to reform bureaucracy. But if commanders warn that a capability served an operational purpose, eliminating it requires a stronger justification than simply declaring the old system unnecessary. And then there is the political decision above all of this. The record described competing advice before the conflict escalated. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard reportedly warned about the potential consequences of removing Iran's supreme leader. including the possibility that an even harder line government could emerge. Vice President J.D. Vance was described as favoring diplomacy. Meanwhile, Hegseth, CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu were associated with the argument for a more aggressive approach. Presidents receive conflicting advice. Choosing one side is literally part of the job. But once the president chooses, responsibility follows the choice. Donald Trump cannot simultaneously claim the authority of commander-in-chief when the strategy is announced and then treat battlefield consequences as somebody else's problem when the assumptions fail. That is where Admiral Cooper's role deserves scrutiny. The central allegation from military officials is that Trump was receiving an overly optimistic picture of the conflict, emphasizing successful strikes against Iranian leadership while failing to communicate the full reality developing across the region. We should be precise here. An allegation that commanders told the president what he wanted to hear is not proof that intelligence was deliberately falsified. There is a substantial difference between optimism, flawed judgment, selective briefing, and intentional deception. But there is a way to judge the outcome without pretending we know someone's private motive. Compare the expectations with the consequences. If the strategy assumed American bases could remain protected, examine the damage to those bases. If planners assumed missile defenses could sustain the fight, examine interceptor consumption and replacement capacity. If officials expected regional allies to remain dependent on Washington's security umbrella, examine the new security arrangements those governments began pursuing. If the administration believed removing experienced commanders would improve military effectiveness, examine the vacancies and operational capabilities that followed. Intentions are difficult to prove, outcomes are visible, and the regional consequence may outlast the immediate military confrontation. Countries including Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Turkey have been exploring new security relationships as confidence in traditional American protection has been tested. At the same time, the Trump administration has moved toward giving Saudi Arabia access to civilian nuclear technology. Civilian nuclear cooperation is not the same thing as giving Saudi Arabia a nuclear weapon. That distinction matters. A civilian program can operate under safeguards and international monitoring. But nuclear expertise and infrastructure inevitably carry proliferation concerns, particularly in a region where governments are reconsidering their security arrangements. So Washington could now face an uncomfortable chain reaction. A military strategy intended to demonstrate American dominance contributes to regional insecurity. That insecurity pushes partners toward alternative arrangements, and the United States then offers additional strategic technology to keep those relationships from drifting further away. That is a very different picture from simple victory or defeat, and it brings us back to the Army. The most consequential evidence here is not an insulting description of Pete Hegseth, Donald Trump, or any general. Those are political judgments. The consequential evidence is structural. The Army lost senior four-star leadership. Key positions remained empty. Officers associated with modernization and recent combat lessons were removed. Missile defense faced an expensive sustainability problem. American facilities suffered serious damage. Civilian protection capabilities that commanders reportedly wanted preserved were cut and then reconsidered. And experienced military voices began publicly questioning whether the United States could maintain the regional access it previously took for granted. Those facts do not establish that every personnel decision caused every battlefield setback. Wars contain variables no commander can fully control. Iran adapts, intelligence fails, weapons malfunction, adversaries exploit weaknesses. Even excellent commanders make mistakes. What they do establish is responsibility for the environment in which those setbacks occurred. Civilian leadership chose the commanders. Civilian leadership chose which commanders to remove. Civilian leadership decided which warnings deserved attention. The commander-in-chief chose among competing recommendations. And when those choices produce measurable consequences, accountability cannot stop at the uniformed officers carrying out the strategy. That is the contradiction we started with. The administration presented disruption as strength. Yet some of the clearest warning signs now involve the institutional capacity lost during that disruption. The unresolved question is how permanent the damage becomes. Vacancies can be filled, production can increase, missile inventories can eventually be rebuilt, alliances can sometimes be repaired, programs that were eliminated can be restored. But experienced leadership cannot be recreated overnight, and strategic credibility is harder to manufacture than a missile. That is why this matters even if you never follow Pentagon personnel battles. The people making these decisions control forces funded with your tax dollars and deployed in your name. When a political administration chooses loyalty, ideology, or institutional disruption over expertise, the proper test is not whether the decision sounds strong. The test is whether America becomes stronger afterward. Another political clip, military claim, poll, or official explanation will soon ask you to make another judgment before all the evidence is visible. Don't Get Played is a digital method for becoming harder to manipulate and better able to defend your political convictions with evidence. It costs $9 once. Use the first link in the description or pinned comment. Political reaction is immediate. A defensible conclusion has to survive the record.